On this next problem, we have to remind ourselves, what does a 1/2 exponent mean? Well, it means that we have a square root. Then the question becomes, what's inside of it? Well, what's inside of it is going to be whatever's inside the parentheses, which in this problem is a 5 minus 5x. I still have a plus x on the other side on the outside of the parentheses equals 1 on the other side of the equation. So remember, to solve an equation that's got a square root in it, we want to get the square root by itself first. That means I need to get rid of that plus x that's dangling off to the side on the left-hand side. So how do I get rid of a plus x? I'll do the opposite. I'll do a minus x to both sides. And what that will now give me, on the left-hand side, I'll still have the square root of 5 minus 5x. But on the other side, now I'll have 1 minus x. Now that the square root is by itself, though, I can get rid of the square root by doing the opposite, squaring both sides. Remember, don't forget, when you're doing an exponent to both sides, you have to put it in parentheses when you're squaring, cubing, or anything to both sides. So what this will do is this will cancel out my square root with the new squared, leaving me with only what was underneath, which is the 5 minus 5x equals, now be careful with the other side. Remember, the other side was squared, which means there are 2 copies of that 1 minus x there, 2 twins, which means I'm going to actually need to do what? On that right-hand side, I'm going to need to, again, FOIL. So let's go ahead and FOIL that right-hand side out first and see what we get. Well, first of all, we'll multiply out the 1 times 1, which is 1. Then we'll do the 1 times negative x, which is negative x. Then the negative x times 1, which is negative x. And lastly, negative x times negative x is actually a positive x squared. We're going to leave the left-hand side alone for now. Now notice what we end up with is a quadratic equation. So what we would like to do is get everything on one side so that we have 0 on the other side. So, and we'd also like to put this in order if we can at the same time. So the first thing that we'd like to do is get a 0 on the left-hand side. So I can do that by moving the 5 first by subtracting 5 to both sides. That will move the 5 over from one side to the other. I also want to move the negative 5x by adding a 5x to both sides of the equation. So let's see what that gives me. That gives me a 0 on the left-hand side, and then a 1 minus 5 gives me negative 4. Be careful, I do have a bunch of like terms here. I have a negative x, and a 5x. So adding all those together gives me a positive 3x. And I have my x squared at the end. Now, this is perfect. It's a quadratic equation. There is one issue. And the issue is that it's in the wrong order. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go down and reorder it. How do I want to reorder this? I'd like to reorder this with the x squared coming first. So we'll still leave the 0 on the left-hand side, but the right-hand side we want the x squared first, then the 3x, then I want the negative 4 at the end. Now the hope, because I have a quadratic equation now, is that this thing will factor. If it doesn't factor, then I'm stuck with the quadratic formula. But it does factor. You'd be asking for what 2 factors of negative 4 add up to a positive 3. Well, what two factors of a negative 4 add up to a positive 3? Well, that's a positive 4 and a negative 1. Positive 4 times negative 1 will give you the negative 4, but when added up will give you a positive 3. So what this means is that it will factor as an x plus 4 and an x minus 1. And it won't matter which one of those goes first or second. As to, we wrote it as x plus 4 and then the x minus 1, but you could have written it as the x minus 1 times the x plus 4. It doesn't matter which. Now, once it's factored and set equal to 0, we can set each of the pieces equal to 0. So we'd set the x plus 4 equal to 0 and the x minus 1 equal to 0, which would give us two solutions. On the first one, you'd subtract both sides by 4 to get the first solution, which is that x equals negative 4. And on the second equation, you'd have to add 1 to both sides to get the solution x equals 1. Now, you worked really hard on this problem. You also still have to double check that your answer or your solution actually works. We had square roots. We had even roots in the original problem. How do we double check that they work? Well, what we have to do is plug them back into the original problem. Well, remember what the original problem was. The original problem was a square root of 5 minus 5x plus x equals 1. So let's plug in our two answers here. Let's plug in negative 4 first for x. And notice we get negative 4 times negative 5, which is 20. Added to your 5 will give you the square root of 25. Added to, well, square root of 25 is 5. Added to, again, we plugged in your x was negative 4. Well, 5 added to negative 4 does indeed give you 1, so that does work. Okay, that gives us one of our solutions as working. Now we need to test the second solution. Now we need to test x equals 1. So we'll plug in plug in a positive 1 for x. So we'll get negative 5 times 1, which is negative 5. Added to the 5 will give us 0. Square root of 0 is 0. And what we're replugging in for x was a 1, so we'll get 0 plus 1, which is equal to 1. That will work. So we did get two solutions, and both of them do work. So we get two answers. We get the answer negative 4 and positive 1, both of which work. So those are our two solutions. In our last problem, we